Okay, so it is 11:35. Let's start on time so that I will not stop you to go to lunch when we are done with this session. I'm Claudio DeSanti from Dell Technologies, and we will go through today to some security updates that happen in the NVMe-oF fabrics realm. This is our agenda. We will take a look a little bit of basics, some security framework, what has been done, especially with NVMe TCP with TLS. We'll go through the updates that we did in the NVMe.org group to NVMe TCP with TLS. And the final thing, we will look at the definition of usage configuration of NVMe security, not just NVMe TCP, all NVMe security. And this is kind of a presentation of two technical proposals, two TPs, 8018 and 8025, that are not yet ratified, but we expect ratification in a few weeks. So, quick introduction on main threat and the security mechanism for some security. You look at the general concept of a SAN, okay? Host and storage subsystems interconnected by a network, the SAN, exactly. And so, first threat that has been addressed by the NVMe group is access control. The red host should access the red storage, but instead is accessing the blue storage. This is something that should not happen. The way in which this is prevented is through storage access control. In NVMe, it's called namespace mapping or NVMe-oF zoning. And this is something that existed zoning also to the time of Faber channel. The point here is just to enable the red server to access only the red storage. However, in the moment in which you just enable the red server to access the red storage, the green server, as an example, can claim, I am blue, I would like to access blue. So the problem is zoning does not prevent impersonation, does not prevent a device to take the identity of another device and claiming that spoofed identity to access what should not be allowed to access. In order to prevent impersonation or spoofing, the way is to perform authentication. Authentication is a proof of identity. Something we are very familiar whenever as an example, we are traveling to the country, we arrive to the airport, you have to provide your proof of identity to the immigration officer. For a person, the proof of identity is your passport. You will be checked there. In the moment in which your identity is verified, you will be granted access to the country. Here will be very similar, but the identity will be verified on different parameters, depending of the authentication protocol that is being used. And the third security threat is a communication access. In this SAN, there could be this interesting character that can have access to the communication, to the packets that are being exchanged within a host and a storage device, potentially seeing what is exchanged or changing also the content of the traffic over there. In order to protect this, the countermeasure is a secure channel, so data in flights over there, that will provide confidentiality and cryptographic integrity. The two sides of the communication will be able to detect if something has been altered in transit, and the communication is encrypted, so nothing can be seen by this interesting third-party character that we see on the SAN. These are very general threats that every storage area network has. And in fact, if we look at the three main storage area network protocols, iSCSI, Fiber Channel, or NVMe-oF fabrics, we can see that they all address this threat with the storage endpoint authentication. iSCSI defined CHAP and NSRP, Fiber Channel DA CHAP, SCPAP, SCAP, SEAP, and then NVMe fabrics, DHMA CHAP. We can see that the common thing is the CHAP mechanism, the challenge and shake authentication protocol that has been prepared for all these protocols in every possible source. This protocol requires a centralized authentication verification in order to be scalable, and that has been reduced for both Fiber Channel and iSCSI that now is obsolete. And for NVMe, we defined the authentication verification entity. And for secure channel, we have different technology, IPsec, FCsec, or TLS for NVMe over Fabrics. So focusing on this case, NVMe over Fabrics, we can see that everything has been defined. TP8006 defined the authentication protocol. TP8019 defined the authentication verification entity for centralized verification of the HM matchup. And TP8011 defined the use of TLS to achieve a secure channel for TCP only. So why are we here? Everything has been defined. What do we have to do again? Well, everything has been defined, and then we found some surprises. And so this is the reason why I'm here talking to you today. What did we do when we defined the usage of TLS with NVMe TCP? Let's take a look at that. First of all, what is TLS? Very well-known security protocol. Every time you connect to your bank in order to, from your browser to check your account, you are going over TLS. Very well-known, very widespread usage, provide authentication, confidentiality, cryptographic integrity, and the primary usage is over web. We define in TP8011 how to use TLS 1.3 with NVMe over TCP, and is defined only for TCP because TLS is not specified for other transport protocols. Older TLS version, TLS 1.2, is strongly discouraged in favor of TLS 1.3, and even older versions are prohibited also by IETF because have been discovered to be currently unsecure. So what is the structure that we define in TP8011? The main structure we define has been this one. Okay, how do I set up my channel? I set up an NVMe TCP with TLS transport session. Then I will have my connect command in response that establishes the association between a host and a controller. And at this point, my secure channel and the queues are set up and NVMe communication can start. However, how do you set up a TLS channel for NVMe TCP? On the web place, whenever you are connecting to your bank, the things are based on certificates. We use X509 certificates that are defined whenever you are in the web world for IP and for web-based IP identities. As an example, when you connect to your bank, the certificate that the bank will provide to your browser will authenticate the DNS name of the bank that you are connected to. However, NVMe over Fabrics use transport that are not IP-based. So you don't have, every time you are using NVMe, you cannot assume that you have a DNS name available. So as a minimum, we need to expand the certificate structure to enable the use of native NVMe identities. And this is not something that exists, right? For the moment, has not been done. So this is the first piece that says why certificates are not being used so far. We need a new certificate format that would support NVMe NQNs are certificate identities, which is not what is available now. And even if we define it, okay, then we will have to upgrade the certificate infrastructure, PKI infrastructure, certificate authorities, and so on, to support such a new certificate format. But what is really different here is the certificate lifecycle management. Basically, who issues a certificate? Who revokes a certificate, who replaces a certificate. These are the certificate authorities, and the problem is when you are in this SAN environment, who operates them? The common answer to this would be vendors, okay, including OEMs or device vendors. And this is something that has been attempted by SPDM for when you create something enclosed in a single box in order to do authentication of devices that are inside a single box that are under the control of a single OEM. But when you are in a storage area network, you are putting together different devices, not necessarily coming from the same OEM, from a consistent set of vendors and so on. The problem is the existing internet or web-based certificate authorities are not managed in this way. And you cannot even assume that, oh, no matter what, I can connect to the internet in order to use the existing certificate authorities. Because in most cases, storage area networks are deployed separate from other network infrastructure. So you cannot assume even that you have this type of connectivity. So for the moment, the TLS credentials that we defined for NVMe over fabrics are not X509 certificates. That's the main point there. Just for the moment, there could be work that will get there. What we have are pre-share keys, which is an easier way to set up a TLS channel. So in order to communicate over TLS, two NVMe entities need to be configured with the same PSK, with the same secret thing that only the two of us now know. And each pair of entities in a fabric requires its own PSK. And this is done to limit the blast radius in case one PSK has been compromised. The problem of this approach is that this is a O of n square problem. If I have n hosts and m subsystems in a fabric, I now need n per m PSKs. Given that we defined the authentication protocol DHA matchup, what also we defined in the P811 has been a way to use the authentication protocol to resolve this problem, the so-called TLS concatenation. Because when a DHA matchup exchange or transaction is performed between a host and a subsystem, this protocol can generate a session key, basically a PSK computed on the fly. And so I could first authenticate my two entities, and then I generate this PSK on the fly, and then I perform the TLS negotiation based using the PSK that is generated from this on-the-fly PSK. And in this way, I now reduce the TLS PSK provisioning to the provisioning of DHA matchup secret. And when you have an AVE, a centralized authentication verification entity, this is an order of n problem. A fabric with n host and m subsystem requires just n plus m secrets. And so this is why this makes the problem tractable. And so we defined in the P811 this look at this word old that I put here. This method of doing TLS concatenation in which, okay, we start with your TCP transport session establishment. You have your connect command to associate host and controller. Then you perform an authentication transaction that generates the PSK. You use, at this point, you stop the NVMe operation and you have to do, okay, now we tell the transport, tell TCP, please do an upgrade. I give you a PSK, go from plain TCP to TLS, and now the session is encrypted, and now we are ready to continue the operation. Well, we discovered that this idea stop a little the NVMe operations, and while you are upgrading your connection and then you restart, is not so easy to be done. Let's continue to take a look. So, first of all, we had a problem of TLS scope, of a PSK scope. Okay, we generate a PSK. What is the scope of this PSK? Let's take a look at the problem. In the P811, we define two methods to define a PSK, as we say. The first one is a retain PSK, something that I administratively provision. So the administrator set up a PSK on the host, set up a PSK on the subsystem. That is what will be used to set up the TLS connection. Or the generated PSK, which is what just said, in which we perform first an authentication transaction. The authentication transaction generates this PSK, and then I use this one. When you're using a TLS, when you're using a PSK in TLS, the way in which the TLS handshake works, there is a client and a server. The client says, hey, I would like, in the client hello says, I would like to set up a TLS session with you, and please use this PSK. So you need a PSK identity, something that enables the client to communicate to the server. I want to use PSK A rather than B, rather than C, rather than D. Each PSK needs to have one PSK identity in order for the TLS handshake to happen correctly from the server between a TLS client and a TLS server and set up the TLS connection. And so we defined two types of PSKs and we defined two types of PSK identities. One for the retain PSK, you see NVMe format identifier 0 retain PSK, the hash that we are going to use in this TLS transaction, and the two NQNs, the two identities, host and controller, that are going to communicate. Host and subsystem are going to communicate. Or for the generated PSK, same structure, but we have a G rather than an R. So we have these two identities that allows to uniquely identify the PSK that a client and a TLS client and TLS server needs to use in order to set up the TLS connection. The scope of a retain PSK was defined to be per entity pair. So, in the moment in which I administratively configure a PSK on a host, administratively configure a PSK on a subsystem, well, all the communication between this host and this subsystem will use that PSK. That is fairly straightforward to say. I configure this information to get there. However, the scope of a generated PSK was not well defined. At the beginning, we were thinking, well, it could be something just per each queue. But then we say, no, we could use that one across the same generated PSK, you could use across multiple queues, or can be used across multiple entity pairs. Okay, and if we do that, how do we identify them? Let's look at the scopes. Use case 1, per controller scope. I have my host, I have my subsystem. I set up my admin queue first with a TCP handshake and then the ICRESP and connect commands. Then I do a DHM matchup transaction that generates a PSK in a global state. And at this point, I can use this generated PSK to do the TLS handshake and go on the admin queue on TLS. Now I'm protected on the admin queue. But I have also a global generated PSK that I set up, and so I can use that one for the IO queues to go straight there. I do my TCP handshake, my TLS handshake, and then I do my ICRESP and connect, and the IOQ1 is ready. Same for IOQ2, same for IOQN. So this is the way in which I have one PSK per one controller. But I could have a per queue scope instead, in which, okay, first I generate a PSK for the admin queue. You see here the DHM matchup transaction. I generate the PSK and I use it to perform a TLS handshake. And I can use exactly the same process for the first IO queue. I do my TCP handshake, ICRESP connect, and DHM matchup transaction. From there, I generate a PSK and I use it to set up my TLS connection. Same for IOQ2, same for IOQN. And so here I would have different PSKs per each of these queues, so per each of the TCP connection in this NVMe TCP association between this host and this subsystem. But at the beginning, we were also thinking that even a mixed scope could have been okay. I could do, I do my TLS concatenation to set up the TLS connection on the admin queue. Then I use this generated PSK over there for the IOQ1. IOQ2, I want to be special, and so rather than reusing the same PSK, I start in TCP, I do a DHM matchup transaction, I get a new PSK, I set up my TLS handshake. And instead, for IOQN, I can still use this generated PSK. Well, the problem we figured out that there is a single PSK identity that has been defined. And we have multiple use cases to use PSKs. A single PSK identity for all generated PSKs does not enable to distinguish which PSK I need to use for which case. And that is the problem. The easy example is this one. Suppose you have a host that wants to connect to a subsystem and you have two controllers on this subsystem, controller 1, controller 2. And I would like to have two different PSKs, one for host to controller 1 and one for host to controller 2. Is really the case in which I have one PSK per association, which is really the use case that makes sense for the most. I cannot do that because in my PSK identity, I only have a type identifier of PSK generated or retained, and then I have just the NQN of the host and the NQN of the subsystem. So the PSK identity for the connection host to controller 1 and the PSK identity from the connection host to controller 2 will be the same. Therefore, also the PSK has to be the same. I cannot distinguish these two PSKs. This has been the problem that came out. Solution approach comes in two parts. First of all, we defined a new format for PSK identities that will enable now per PSK unique identities. Now I can support in a non-ambiguous manner multiple scopes of a PSK. And then we decided also to restrict the TLS PSK generation only to the admin queue. So basically supports only use case 1. And reuse the PSK generated of the admin queue for all the IO queues. So first piece, we defined the concept of a PSK digest. Whenever a PSK is generated by VHM matchup or even provisioned, we use a secure hash, the one associated with the PSK, to compute a digest. We take the PSK as the key of the HMAC function, and we compute a digest on the host NQN, the NVM subsystem NQN. And then we convert to ASCII via base 64 conversion. Now we get a unique digest which is associated to a specific PSK. At this point, we make the PSK identity unique because we add this digest to the PSK identity. So we change the format of the PSK identity from format 0 to format 1, and then we have, the hash identifier, the two NQNs, and the digest. Now the resulting identity uniquely identifies a specific PSK because the HMAC size is at least 256 bits, and so a different PSK produces a different digest and therefore a different PSK identity. Once I have this per PSK identity, now I get the ability to use any generated PSK on just one controller, on multiple controllers, on just one queue. I basically have the ability to do whatever I like. Also, we resolve another problem when we apply this thing on the retained PSK, which is the rollover support. Again, the problem of having a single identity. Suppose you administratively provisioned one PSK on host A and on subsystem B. And then you say, I want to update the PSK. I want to put a new one. And the way in which you would expect to do is, I configure the new PSK on the subsystem, I configure the new PSK on the host, and now that we both have, let's start to use the new PSK. Wait a moment, how do I identify the new PSK? With the old way, I had only a single identity for a PSK. And so there was no way to establish this switch from the old PSK to the new one, to basically have a PSK rollover. Now with per PSK identities, we get the ability to have a rollover. And so at this point, we are able to support multiple scopes also for a PSK. As an example, if I want to support a generated PSK on a per entity pair scope, means I have a PSK that I will use for all my queues over this host and subsystem, I just perform one DHM matchup transaction. And then I use that to set up all my TLS connections across all the interfaces, across all the controllers between these two entities. This is a way in which I'm able to do that. And you can see the HM matchup will define one PSK with its own ID. I reuse that PSK and PSK IDs for all TLS connections. If I want to support a pair association scope instead, I perform a first DHM matchup transaction and I get a pair PSK-ID, PSK1. And now I use that one to set up my first set of TLS connection using PSK1 and PSK-ID1. Then I perform another DHM matchup transaction and I get another set of PSK and PSK-ID. And I use this one to set up additional TLS connections. And I can repeat the scheme as many times I want, in which basically I can generate as many PSKs as I want. Each of these PSK now are uniquely identified, and so then whenever I go to set up a TLS connection, by putting the proper PSK identity on the TLS client hello, I'm able to define and select which PSK to use in order to set up the TLS connection. And then, as I said, we also decided to say we support only use case 1, which is what everyone wanted. We perform TLS concatenation on the admin queue, in which basically, okay, we start in TCP, we perform the DHM matchup transaction, and we generate here a TLS handshake, and so we transform at that point the admin queue over a TLS connection. And then we have this generated PSK that is generated on the admin queue that will be then used to set up all the TLS connections for all the IO queues. But here and everything seems fine. We resolved the problem here, but then we discovered another interesting thing, what I was mentioning before. A funny thing happened. Reminder what I said. In TLS concatenation, switch to TLS in the middle of a TCP stream, which is something that we knew it works because it's something that has been used for years by SMTP. So we have this DHM matchup authentication performing the clear, generates the PSK. That TLS PSK is used to authenticate the TLS handshake, and in this way, we move the connection from plain TCP to TCP with TLS. This is called opportunistic TLS. And then we got a question. This was the theory. What about practice? A question from an implementer. What do I do with NVMe commands that arrive during the TLS handshake? That was not supposed to happen. There should not be TLS commands going on while there is a TLS handshake going on. But the code is doing that. What should I do? Okay, we discovered that this little issue, which is actually an example of an known problem with opportunistic TLS. While you have the TLS negotiation going on, the TCP connection is already active. And so there could be some traffic going on in the clear over that TCP connection. And so what to do there? Solution approach of also here. Two pieces. Part A, we decided to change to a second TCP connection. And so now TLS concatenation will operate that, okay, we first do a DHM matchup transaction on a first TCP connection, we generate a PSK, and then we disconnect. We reconnect, and we do immediately the TLS handshake using that TLS handshake. And at this point, we are in a much more cleaner situation. And what happens to unexpected non-TLS traffic? If there was some non-TLS traffic on the first TCP connection, well, it remains stranded over there because the second TCP connection uses a different TCP source port. And so, in the moment in which we clean up the first TCP connection, we have a robust assurance of discard. Part B, if there is an unexpected non-TLS traffic on the second connection, this will close the second connection. And this one is now very easy to detect because it will be clearly an attempt of a security violation, because the second connection will start immediately with a TLS handshake. So let's look at it in diagrams. So here we see what happens. We begin our TLS concatenation, TCP handshake, ICRESP, and then the connect command, the admin queue is ready. And we set up our stack, TCP, NVMe, TCP, NVMe-oF. Now we do the DHM matchup transaction and we generate a PSK. At this point, we disconnect. Nothing else is there. We are clean now, but we have a PSK. Now that we have a PSK, we restart. Okay, and now we generate another admin queue, and we do now go straight with TCP unshake, TLS unshake. So we are straight in TLS, and then the ICREC, ICREST exchange, and the connect. And every other IO queue will be done through exactly the same set of unshakes and set of protocols. So the admin queue first generates in the clear the generated PSK, and then disconnect the TCP connection. Then the admin queue is reinstantiated over a TLS connection using the generated PSK that was done on the previous TCP connection. That is the new approach to perform TLS concatenation. And so, updated, this is the diagram that actually went through the TP8018 technical proposal and will be part of the next iteration of the NVMe-based spec. We start with a transport session establishment on TCP, your connect response to establish the association, authentication transaction, generate a PSK, and then the transportation is disconnected. At that point, from that PSK, we will have an NVMe TCP TLS transport session establishment. Connect goes there, secure channel for admin queue is set up. And exactly the same process for all the IO queues that we want to establish between this host and this controller. So this is the first set of updates, the ones that were related to TP8080. Another item that also came out is, okay, we defined authentication protocol, we defined secure channel protocol, TLS and so on, how to put them together, but when do we use DHM matchup? When do we use TLS? Or when do we use TLS concatenation? Is decided by the host? Is decided by the subsystem? When do we use a specific security mechanism? That is something that was left unspecified. And so this is why we did technical proposal 8025 to tackle on this problem. How is this negotiation, how are these security mechanisms used? When specifically? And for this, basically, we had to define a set of common terminology and a set of schemes that enabled to say, okay, this is how we do this process. First of all these security mechanisms are based on some quantities. The DHM matchup requires the provisioning of a secret. Or if you want to use a retained PSK for TLS, you need to provision, to configure a configure PSK. So if a security mechanism is not provisioned, means I did not put the proper information to use it, well, no matter what you want to do, you cannot use it, because that is fundamental to the execution of the security mechanisms. So first of all, a security mechanism needs to have provisioning done. Once a security mechanism is provisioned, at this point we defined a three-way to configure the usage of that mechanism. A mechanism can be disabled, which means no matter what, don't use it. It's the same as it is unprovisioned or you don't support that thing. You will not use it. Or it can be required, which means, okay, no matter what, in order to continue your channel establishment, queue establishment, whatever, you need to authenticate, or there is no connection. That is required. It has to be used. And there is also a permitted case, which is what you have, something that you need to negotiate with the other party. And why do we need a permitted case? Well, we need it because security for NVMe over fabrics is something that has been just defined in the last couple of years. But NVMe over fabrics has been defined way before. Products are out and implementations are being deployed without any security at the moment. But customers ask for security, so security will have to get there. So we need to get to a situation, we'll have to go through a migration from zero security to full security. And when you are in this situation of migration in which you need to introduce security in a customer environment without security, well, the permitted case, basically a more liberal way to introduce security, is something that is really needed. And so the general logic of the usage behavior that we defined is basically this one. If a security mechanism is disabled, doesn't matter what the other entity configuration is, the security mechanism is not used. If you are to configure to do not authenticate, you will not authenticate. End of story. Instead, if a security mechanism is required, it has to be used, no matter what the other entity configuration is. If the other entity configuration does not support that security mechanism, well, you will disconnect your NVMe connection. If a host is configured to say, I require TLS, and the subsystem does not want to use it because it's disabled over there or is not supported, well, the host will disconnect from that subsystem. And that is the expected behavior when something is required and the other party does not support it. And then you have the transition mechanism. If something is permitted, it means basically, oh, the other guy will decide. And so the host will let the subsystem decide, the subsystem will let the host decide. Wait, now we are in a tie break. We need a tiebreaker over there because if each of the two entities let the other one decide, then basically no one does anything. And so the way that we decided to go through is when a security mechanism is permitted, the host decides about using the mechanism from the discovery log entry about the NVM subsystem. And the NVM subsystem instead let the host decide. That is the general logic that we defined. And so the overall security processing, at TCP connection time, if I have a TLS provisioned for direct TLS, follow the TLS usage configuration, and that will be the behavior. After completion of the connect command, if authentication is provisioned, well, and if TLS is not there or the connection already in TLS, then I will do authentication only behavior. If instead I support TLS concatenation, then I will follow authentication with TLS concatenation usage behavior. So that's how everything is put together when you are doing your processing. And let's consider an example of this behavior. Example, TLS usage configuration. On a host or on a subsystem, the configuration could be TLS is disabled, as we said, or TLS is permitted, or TLS is required. When it's disabled, means that only TCP connection without TLS are allowed. When it's required, only TCP connection with TLS are allowed. When it's permitted, both types of TCP connection with or without TLS are allowed. So let's look at the host behavior. If it is disabled, the host will not initiate a TCP connection with TLS. It will initiate only TCP connection without TLS. If it is required, the host will initiate TCP connection always with a TLS handshake immediately after the TCP handshake, so always with TLS. If it is permitted, the host will look at this field, inside this field in the discovery log page, look if the number is 1, if the value is 37 or 72 or 43, doesn't matter what it is, but basically we'll look at the entry in the fields in the discovery log entry to figure out what to do, and so to establish a TCP connection with TLS or without TLS. And on the subsystem side, again, the usage configuration can be TLS disabled, permitted, or required. In the subsystem side, when the TCP connection is received, okay, if TLS is disabled, the subsystem will close the TCP connection if a TLS handshake is initiated upon completion of the TCP handshake. If it is required, instead, it will be the opposite behavior. The subsystem will close the TCP connection if the TLS handshake is not initiated upon completion of the TCP handshake. And instead, if TLS is permitted, the subsystem will be kind of liberal. Continue all TCP connections, whether there is a TLS handshake after a TCP handshake or not. So, and this basically gives you an idea of basically on how all the pieces of the architecture has been now defined, and we have a full architecture set up. So, conclusion: these two new TPUs, TP8018 and TP8025, completed the security architectures for NVMe over fabrics and closing all the holes and the issues related to early implementations. Now we have a fully consistent and tested architecture for NVMe and for security for NVMe over fabrics. And here I am. Any questions? Yes?
So you talked about determining whether or not the TLS handshake is received. How does the controller differentiate the TLS handshake from IC? Is it impossible to have a TLS handshake that looks like
Okay, let me repeat the question. The question is, how can a subsystem differentiate between an ICREC command or the beginning of a TLS handshake? The initial bytes of what you receive on the TCP stream in the two cases will be different. So that's how you differentiate. Any other question? Yes?
Not so much of a question, but just an FYI, at the EFTF Experium, we are working on binding that to TCP.
Okay.
You mentioned Experium as a potential specific identity.
Mm-hmm.
That work is happening, it will take some time to.
Let me repeat the comment. Basically, we'll say that SPDM is currently working on a mapping of certificates for IP-based NVMe and for SPDM protocol over TCP, and so this could be a possible viable option when we will explore using certificates for NVMe over TLS. Thank you. Another question.
So when the admin queue is disconnected, how long do the different sides need to retain the generated PSK for? When can they forget them?
Okay, we defined also that it is something that the mechanism is flexible. You could discard it, and in the moment in which you try to set up a TLS connection and the other side does not have that PSK, you are able basically to, okay, let me start a DHMHR transaction, generate a new PSK, and now we are using that. So first of all, the mechanism is robust from that point of view. And then in the specification, we say that the retain time is kind of undefined, but we expect to refresh a PSK more or less every 10 minutes or something like that. So the expectation, many people think that you could keep it almost indefinitely, okay? And so the way in which we handle the problem has been to make the protocol robust, so that if you are trying to set up something, it can be regenerated on the fly, and specifying this indicative time for a good refresh, basically every 10 minutes or which is actually then administrator defined. It could be every 10 minutes, every half an hour, every hour, there should be a transaction to refresh the PSK, the generated PSK that you keep for all your TLS connections. Any other question? Yes? Okay, the question is, if every 10 minutes we need to refresh the generated PSK, do we need to disconnect existing connection and reconnect? The answer is no. Everything that is up and running will continue to use the previous PSK. And TLS has its own mechanism to refresh the PSK over a specific TLS connection once it is set up. the new PSK, the regenerated PSK will be used for every new connections, not for the ones that are already established. Any final question before lunch? People are hungry. Thank you.